So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here, with a third episode of what originally I thought might be a 1 or 2 video series on Answers in Genesis Canada. Originally, it was just a short video from years ago. Basically, these darn Canadian pseudoscience peddlers keep giving me homework and I keep doing it for some reason. Anyway, when last we were here, we were going through an article by Carl Weiland. Wieland? I don't know. He had set up an absurd strawman of artificial selection in which he ignored mutation. Then he went over polyploidy and hybridization in about a sentence each, and misunderstood both, or perhaps lied about both. But now we're on to mutation. Let's see what he has to say about the thing he pretended for most of this paper wasn't a factor.
Since mutations are basically accidents, it is not surprising that they are observed to be largely harmful, lethal, or meaningless to the function or survival of an organism. Random changes in a highly ordered code introduce noise and chaos, not meaning, function, and complexity, which tend to be lost.
Actually, in this case, it tends to be maintained, and that's without taking selection into account. The vast majority of mutations cause literally no change at all, because when you add up mutations that occur in non-functional regions and those that result in synonymous codons, you get the majority of mutations. Such mutations have little to no effect on anything. Of the remaining mutations, it's true that most are going to be harmful in most or all environments.
However, it is conceivable that in a complex world, occasionally a destructive change will have a limited usefulness.
Then how is it destructive? We see new genes arise, new proteins form, new anatomical features arise, new metabolic pathways evolve. How is any of this destructive? I guess you could say that everything is destructive. My jaw had to destroy ancestral gill arches to evolve, and my limbs had to destroy ancestral fins in order to exist, and so on. But no one with any sense would frame it that way, unless of course they wanted to pretend that the simple fact that evolution causes changes was on its own bad, but wanted to do so without coming out and saying it directly, since that would be an obviously stupid take.
For example, if we knock out a sentence such that there is a decrease in leg length in sheep, and there is such a mutation.
There is indeed. Or rather there was. The breed is now extinct, but it did exist and they were the Ancon sheep. Now the mutation has cropped up a few more times, but it was not bred for and so there are no current flocks of such sheep. As for what caused the trait, it was obviously a mutation, but as for knocking out a sentence, I don't know what that means. As far as I can tell, no one has actually determined exactly what mutation causes this trait. Carl seems to be implying that the mutation was the deletion of a gene, but I can't find any reason to think that that's true. I do know that whatever causes it is recessive because when an Ancon sheep is crossed with another sheep, all the offspring have normal legs. But when those offspring mate with other offspring of Ancon sheep, some of the resultant sheep have short legs. So all we can say about this mutation is that it's recessive, and causes short limbs with enlarged joints that tend to become crooked with age.
This is useful to stop them from jumping over the farmer's fence.
And that's it. No further discussion about Ancon sheep. I don't know why not. I don't know what point that was supposed to illustrate. Except maybe that the fitness effect of mutations are dependent on the environment, which is true. In fact, that's a core aspect of evolutionary biology.
A beetle on a lonely, windswept island may have a mutation which causes it to lose or corrupt the information coding for wing manufacture.
What does that even mean? Beetles don't have wing blueprints. Does this mean that their wing covers, which are themselves broken wings, fuse? Does it mean that the wings under the covers are small? Does it mean that the wings never grow at all, meaning no wings or wing covers? These are all different things.
Hence, its wingless successor will not be so easily blown out to sea, and will thus have a selective advantage.
Oh, okay, that's it. Just again pointing out that a mutation might be helpful in an environment, while it obviously might not be in another one. Cool. I bet it happens again with the next point.
Eyeless fish in caves.
Wait, is this secretly being written by Randy Galuza? I mean, I've never seen Carl Weiland and Randy Galuza in the same room at the same time. So maybe.
some cases of antibiotic resistance. The handful of cases of mutations which are quite beneficial do not involve the sort of increase in functional complexity which evolutionary theory demands.
I don't know what functional complexity is or how to measure whether it has gone up or down. This is a continuous problem with not just this article, but really Creationsts talking points as a whole. They'll demand that some quantity of something that they haven't actually defined go up, and then since no one knows what it would even look like for some unexplained quantity to go up, or how to measure its amount in the first place, no one can do it. The Creationists will then count their own inability to actually define terms as a win. What really happened, though, is that it shows that Creationists can't even make an argument against evolution that makes sense on its own terms. At most, I can kind of parse this as saying that we don't see new genes evolving, but we do. New antifreeze proteins evolved in some fish from digestive enzymes. Bacteria have evolved brand new enzymes to digest various kinds of plastic. Primates evolved new genes for a third kind of cone cell in the eye, allowing them to be more or less the only mammals with trichromatic vision. The fact that he cherry-picked some beneficial mutations that did not involve new proteins doesn't mean that examples that do involve such don't exist.
Nor would one expect this to be possible from a random change.
Or maybe they would expect it. I guess it depends on what in the name of the dark gods functional complexity is.
At this point, some will argue that the terms useful, meaningful, functional, etc. are misused.
I would love to say that, but I can't, because I don't know how they're being used at all.
They claim that if some change gives survival value, then, by definition, it has biological meaning and usefulness.
I would not say that, no. What I would say is that it's beneficial, because that has a standard definition in evolutionary biology, and I like to use the terms that are actually used to describe things in the field I'm discussing. Something that's beneficial to me is when people like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It's one of the only ways that YouTube knows to send my videos to more people, even the people who already told YouTube that they want to see my videos. So why not hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, turn on all notifications, and leave me a comment.
But this assumes that living systems do nothing but survive, when in fact they and their subsystems carry out projects and have specific functions.
Well, let's assume that Carl meant beneficial, in which case, no, it doesn't assume that all cells or organisms do is survive. First, evolution isn't about survival, it's about reproduction. Survival only matters in evolution to the degree to which it permits more reproduction. Also, survival itself as well as reproduction are not simple tasks, and for most organisms, both involve all sorts of other processes. Mutations are beneficial if they allow an organism to contribute to a larger degree to the genetic makeup of future generations, and deleterious if it causes the organism to contribute to a lesser degree to the same. Why is this what is relevant in evolution? Well, evolution is all about change in populations of organisms over time, and only reproduction affects this. If you can't make copies of yourself during your lifetime, then after that time you won't be relevant to what genetics the organisms that exist will have.
That is, they carry teleonomic information.
Teleonomy is the apparent design and purposefulness in organisms, and if we accept that information has any actual definition in this paper, then I would say that yes, genes do usually, although not always, carry information which appears purposeful, and so it's fair to say that some of them carry teleonomic information.
This is one of the essential differences between living objects and non-living ones, apart from machines.
That they have heritable teleonomic information? Actually, I can kind of get on board with that, but that's a problem though. Creationists want them to have teleological information. That is actually design and purposeful information. Teleonomic information is just information that appears that way because its existence has helped perpetuate itself, regardless of anyone's or anything's wishes or design.
These projects do not always give rise to survival or reproductive advantages. In fact, they may have very little to do with survival, but are carried out very efficiently.
Sometimes things that help with survival or reproduction are done when they aren't doing that thing. But that doesn't negate that they're there because they help with survival or reproduction. An obvious example might be a human couple who have voluntarily opted not to have children, but who still engage in sexual intercourse. Clearly, their sexual intercourse isn't helping with reproduction, but because it being fun and having bonding effects on humans who engage in it together evolved to encourage reproduction, they do it for the fun and bonding without the reproduction. This isn't really that hard to understand, unless, of course, you're trying to not understand it. The same is true of the people who drink diet soda. Diet soda has effectively no nutrients in it, and it's not even a great source of hydration. However, it has an artificial sweetener that makes it taste like a high-calorie substance, and animals in general love calorie-dense food, so to humans it tastes great, so they drink it.
The Darwinian assumption is always made, of course, that sometime in the organism's evolutionary history, the project had survival or reproductive value.
Put in the comments if you think he'll have a counterexample where we can say with any confidence that it did not.
For example, the archerfish with its highly skilled hobby of shooting down bugs, which it does not require for survival at the present time.
That's literally how archerfish eat. That's pretty damn tied to survival and reproduction. What does Carl think archerfish eat? Because it's insects and other small animals that they shoot down with jets of water from highly derived mouthparts. They're not hunting for trophies, they're hunting to put food on the metaphorical table.
However, since these are non-testable assumptions, it is legitimate to talk about genetic information in a teleonomic sense, in isolation from any possible survival value.
That's it? His only example is a fish who uses its so-called hobby as its actual primary way of getting food? If this article were a high school paper, I'd give it a D at best.
Gene pools of today carry vast quantities of information, coding for the performance of projects and functions, which do not exist in the theoretical primeval cell.
Well, yeah, creatures today have to contend with a far more complex environment and much more competition than any first cell would have had to. Also, genetic drift can and does needlessly complexify biochemical processes, and it's been a few billion years, so drift has had a lot of time to do that.
Hence, in order to support protozoan to man evolution, one must be able to point to instances where mutation has added a new sentence, or gene coding for a new project or function.
Okay.
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Notothenioid icefish! These are fish that live in the Antarctic and had a partial gene duplication in their trypsinogen gene that neo-functionalized into an antifreeze protein, allowing them to survive in colder water than their close relatives who lack such a protein, allowing them to colonize the Southern Ocean. In case you're wondering, trypsinogen is a protein that is made primarily in the pancreas, and it is converted into trypsin when the protein digestion is needed. Trypsin breaks down proteins and is stored as trypsinogen because it would otherwise start to break down the pancreas itself, since that's largely made of protein. Well, that was easy.
This is so regardless of one's assumption on the survival value of any project or function.
I gotta level with you. I have no clue what that sentence is doing in this paragraph. Was Carl okay when he wrote this? Like, was he suffering from a neurological problem and me doing this whole series is now just me mocking a man with a medical problem that caused him to do this? I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. But on the other hand, he said things that make me think he knows better and is just being dishonest, as is typical for the professional creationist. So maybe I shouldn't feel bad about this at all and should continue eviscerating this nonsense.
We do not know a single mutation giving such an increase in functional complexity.
Don't we, though? I mean, we did just have this. Okay.
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Notothenioid icefish! These are fish that live in the Antarctic and had a partial gene duplication in their trypsinogen gene that neo-functionalized into an antifreeze protein, allowing them to survive in colder water than their close relatives who lack such a protein, allowing them to colonize the Southern Ocean. In case you're wondering, trypsinogen is a protein that is made primarily in the pancreas, and it is converted into trypsin when the protein digestion is needed. Trypsin breaks down proteins and is stored as trypsinogen because it would otherwise start to break down the pancreas itself, since that's largely made of protein. Well, that was easy.
Probabilistic considerations would seem to preclude this in any case, or at least make it an exceedingly rare event.
It is exceedingly rare, and if you have enough goes of it, then they'll happen quite a lot. And if you have a mechanism for preserving the effects of rare events, then you'll be able to accumulate the products of rare events. Life has such a mechanism. It's called natural selection. So of course most organisms look like they result from a series of very rare events. They do. Another thing that's exceedingly rare is for you viewing this to have joined my Patreon. But if you like this kind of thing here on YouTube and you want to see it stick around as long as possible, why not consider joining and making it a bit more common for my viewers to be supporters? The price starts at only $1 a month, and there's a 15% discount if you join with an annual pledge. You get early access to videos like this and access to my supporters-only Discord server. Link in the description.
Far too rare to salvage evolution, even over the assumed multi-billion-year time span.
And of course, Carl has no numbers to back that up. Just trust me, bro. Well, I don't trust creationists, because I've consumed too much of their content and spoken to too many of them. None of them can be trusted. In some cases, it's because they blatantly lie. But for most of them, it's simply because they're woefully undereducated on all the relevant fields. And so everything they say has a higher than even chance of being wrong and needing to be checked on.
To illustrate further, the molecule hemoglobin in man carries out its project of transporting and delivering oxygen in red cells in a functionally efficient manner.
Is he about to tell us that that isn't relevant to survival or reproduction? Because, it super is.
A gene, or sentence, exists which codes for the production of hemoglobin.
It's actually more than one gene, because hemoglobin is actually composed of more than one protein, which are later joined together. See what I mean? I don't think Carl is lying here. I think he's just incompetent. So why would I ever trust him on anything he says? He's shown himself to be incapable of having this conversation in an intelligent way, and also, he's almost certainly lying about some of this, so no one should ever trust him.
There is a known mutation, actually 3 separate ones, giving the same result, in which only one letter in the sentence has been accidentally replaced by another. If you inherit this change from both parents, you will be seriously ill with a disease called sickle cell anemia.
That's true.
Or at least it's true that you'll be sick, and he does seem to be right that it is caused by a single point mutation, specifically in the 6th codon in the beta-globin gene.
And will not survive for very long.
That'll depend on medical care availability, but because the condition is most prominent in areas without easy access to quality medical care, that is sadly true.
Yet evolutionists frequently use this as an example of a beneficial mutation.
Yeah, because when a person carries one sickle cell allele and one normal beta-globin allele, they are resistant to malaria and therefore able to produce more than those who have either 2 sickle cell beta-globin alleles and thereby tend to die of sickle cell disease, or those who have 2 normal beta-globin alleles and who then tend to die of malaria. Because having the heterozygous condition leads to significantly increased resistance to malaria. This means that in an area with a lot of malaria, those who are resistant to it will reproduce more. And that the condition is seen in such high proportions in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria is most prominent, is a prediction of the idea that the sickle cell allele is beneficial.
This is because if you inherit it from only one parent, your red cells will be affected, but not seriously enough to affect your survival, just enough to prevent the malaria parasite from using them as an effective host.
Yup.
Hence, you will be more immune to malaria, and better able to survive in malaria-infested areas. The mutation-caused gene for this disease is maintained at high levels in malaria-endemic regions by this incidental phenomenon of heterozygote superiority. Its damaging effect in a proportion of offspring is balanced by the protection it gives against malaria. It is decidedly not an upward change.
There's no such thing. There is only the genome of organisms and their environment. Evolution isn't a ladder. It's not a great chain of being. There is no hierarchy of awesomeness. Like the rest of the natural world, evolution doesn't particularly care about you or what you want. It simply is.
We have not seen a new, efficient oxygen transport mechanism, or its beginnings, evolve.
Well, yeah, all lineages that need oxygen transport mechanisms Evolved good ones like 2 billion years ago? Why would a new one need to evolve? What lineage needs better oxygen transport that isn't likely to get that by just further refining their own mechanism or amping up its activity? I'm not aware of anything or anyone in evolutionary biology that would predict that we should see new oxygen transport mechanisms evolving today.
We have not seen the hemoglobin transport mechanism improved.
Whoops, that's not true. In fact, beneficial mutations that occurred naturally in human globin genes are currently being investigated for gene therapy to use to treat sickle cell disease. Maybe it was true when Carl wrote this, but in that case, I think it counts as a failed creationist prediction.
One more loose, but possibly useful analogy.
I bet this analogy is worse than useless rather than being useful.
Let us say an undercover agent is engaged in sending a daily, reassuring telegram from enemy territory. The text says, "The enemy is not attacking today." One day, an accident occurs in transmission and the word "not" is lost. This is very likely going to be a harmful change, perhaps even triggering a nuclear war by mistake. But perhaps, in a freak situation, it could turn out to be useful, for example by testing the failsafe mechanisms involved. But this does not mean that it is the sort of change required to begin to convert the telegram into an encyclopedia.
Okay, so far it's at best useless.
The very small number of beneficial mutations actually observed are simply the wrong kind of change for evolution.
Yeah, that's not really a sentence that means anything. We see new genes that gain new functions while either losing or keeping their old function. We have even seen whole new metabolic pathways evolve in real time. The fact that Carl wants to cherry pick mutations that he personally doesn't like that are nonetheless beneficial does nothing to change that. And let's remember that he was just dead wrong about there being no beneficial globin mutations.
We do not see the addition of new sentences which carry meaning and information.
Whoops, except for antifreeze proteins in fish, digestive enzymes, and everything from bacteria to mammals and more, new genes are actually not all that rare. There are plenty of examples.
Again, surprisingly, one often reads creationist works which insist that there is no such thing as a beneficial mutation.
Yeah, like Flat Earth, you have to tell lies to support special creation. I'm glad Carl is calling out some of those lies, but he's just spreading some of his own in their place, which isn't really an improvement.
If benefit is defined purely in survival terms,
which is not, it's defined purely in reproductive terms,
then we would not expect this to be true in all instances. And in fact, it is not.
Correct.
That is, there are indeed beneficial mutations in that sense only.
And that's the only sense that exists in evolutionary biology, and the only one evolutionary biology needs. Last episode, I gave examples of Wikipedia's list of characteristics of pseudoscience, and one of them was using technical jargon incorrectly. And in this case, that's what Carl is doing with the word beneficial. He's pretending that the actual definition of beneficial in evolutionary biology isn't what it actually is, then proposing his own alternative, which is also wrong. This is pseudoscience par excellence.
Information depends on order, and since all our observation and our understanding of entropy tells us that in a natural, spontaneous, unguided, and unprogrammed process, order will decrease, the same will be true of information.
First, the second law of thermodynamics has nothing to do with order. It states that in an isolated system, entropy must increase or stay the same. Well, that has some terms that need definition. Entropy is a measure of the energy in a system that is not available to do work. Work is the displacement of mass over time, so it's energy that can't be used to move anything. A system is just whatever is under consideration, and it is arbitrarily defined by the person doing the thermodynamic analysis. Isolated, in the case of thermodynamics, means that neither matter nor energy can enter or leave the system. So entropy has nothing to do with order, and if we take either organisms or Earth as a system, they are not isolated, so the second law of thermodynamics doesn't apply to them anyway. In fact, it's worse for this. Life actually accelerates the rate at which entropy increases on Earth by exploiting energy gradients that exist, usually chemical or based on sunlight. Every time you eat something with calories, that food contains chemical energy in the bonds of the chemicals like carbohydrates and sugars. You break those bonds in order to release that energy to fuel your own metabolic processes, and the amount of energy you actually use is lower than the total amount in those chemical bonds. The rest is lost to heat that you can't use. That means you've turned some of that energy into heat that can't be used to do work. You've increased entropy in your own body. But it's okay, because you can take in new energy the next time you eat, so you're not an isolated system. But it's even worse than that. You see, the interactions that increase entropy are interactions that can happen spontaneously. In fact, in some ways, spontaneous interaction and interaction that increases entropy are basically the same thing. And you know what? Complexity tends to increase the rate at which entropy increases, because complexity, if measured by number of chemical interactions, means more reactions, each of which increases entropy if they're spontaneous, which means that actually complex chemical systems are thermodynamically favored for as long as there is an energy gradient, like maybe the one caused by sunlight falling onto a planet. And life is just one such complex chemical entropy engine, which means that thermodynamics actually favors not just life, but complex life.
The physicist and communications engineer should not be surprised at the realization that biological processes involve no increase in useful or functional teleonomic information and complexity.
I'm not going to speak for either engineers or physicists, but evolution observably does cause new, useful, and seemingly purposeful genes to arise. It does it kind of a lot. So if physicists and engineers are under the impression that that doesn't happen, well, they're wrong, and they might want to spend a little time talking to people in the biology departments of their universities.
In fact, the net result of any biological process involving transmission of information, i.e., all hereditary variation, is conservation or loss of that genetic information.
Or the generation of new information, which is about as likely as conservation or loss. In fact, in many cases, loss of previous information is the gain of new information, such as in transpositions or point mutations, which replaces previous nucleotide sequences with new ones. And since Carl still hasn't bothered to define information, I'm still going with Shannon information. Now, I'm sure he'd say that that's not what he's talking about, but this isn't my first rodeo, and any definition I went with that would allow me to actually measure information would be one he'd object to. Which means this article isn't really being written in good faith, so I don't particularly care that he doesn't like the definition I'm using. Until he gives one, I'll just keep using it, and I would encourage you listening, even you, Gary, to do the same if you have these conversations with a creationist. Insist that they give a definition of information that would allow it to be measured in a genome, or just use your own definition that does allow that.
This points back directly to the creation of the information, supernaturally, in the beginning. It is completely in harmony with the biblical concept of a world made very good as a balanced, functioning whole with decay only subsequent to the fall.
I don't care if it's in harmony with that story or not. Nothing about biological evolution demands a divine starting point for genetics. And Carl has to tell lies to get to that point, and not all of them even helped him to do it.
This is the reason why there are inevitable limits to variation, why the creationist does not have to worry about how many new species the future may bring, because there's a limit to the amount of functionally efficient genetic information present, and natural processes such as mutation cannot add to this original storehouse.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
You know what else is amazing? My channel members, because they not only help keep the channel going, but they also get cool emojis for live chats, early access to scripted videos like this, and also access to my super secret Discord server, which you can only know about if you join. There's a join button below this video, and the price starts at just $1.99 a month.
Notice that since organisms were created to migrate out from a central point at least once and fill empty ecological niches,
Objection? Assumes facts not in evidence?
as well as having to cope with a decaying and changing environment,
Wouldn't that make the fall inevitable and thereby part of God's design, and so really God's fault, not humans' fault? since according to this, they were created with really no other option. I don't know, I'm not a theologian. All I know is that this kind of smells like God being the author of evil. You know, like it says he is in Isaiah 45:7. But hey, it's not my problem. I'm not someone who thinks that taking the Bible literally is a good way to learn about the world.
They would require considerable variation potential.
Wow, it sucks then that that's impossible if only 2 representatives of any given lineage that persists to this day were on the ark, giving a maximum of 4 alleles for any gene. I guess the Noah's flood story is impossible for genetic reasons as well as hydrologic, thermodynamic, and geological reasons. Almost like it was a story about events that didn't really happen, written by people who had virtually no knowledge of things like thermodynamics, geology, hydrology, or genetics.
Without this built-in genetic flexibility, most populations would not be present today. Hence, the concept of biological change is in a sense predicted by the biblical model, not something forced upon it only because such change has occurred.
Except that it was forced on it historically because of such change. Like, we can go read older creationist literature, going all the way back to Linnaeus. Creationists consistently rejected as much change as possible, accepting only the minimum change that they cannot deny, and also always claim that they would expect this much change anyway.
The created kind.
This ought to be good.
The scriptures imply that this originally created information was not in the form of one superspecies from which all of today's populations have split off by this thinning out process, but was created as a number of distinct gene pools. Each group of sexually reproducing organisms had at least 2 members. Thus, 1. Each original group began with a built-in amount of genetic information, which is the raw material for virtually all subsequent useful variation.
By the way, I'm just going to let him describe his own model. I can't really critique it on its own grounds as the thing he believes. But where the critique can come is where his model makes predictions that fail to live up to reality, or when another model makes predictions that, if true, would preclude his model, and they turn out to be true.
2. Each original group was presumably genetically and reproductively isolated from other such groups, yet was able to interbreed with its own group. Hence, the original kinds would truly have earned the modern biological definition of species. We saw in our dog example that such species can split into 2 or more distinct subgroups, which can then diverge, without adding anything new.
Something he had to tell lies about to support, I'd like to add.
And can end up with the characteristics of species themselves. That is, reproductively isolated from each other, but freely interbreeding among themselves.
Making interfertility useless as a criterion for falsifying the hypothesis that organisms are of the same alleged kind.
The more variability in the original gene pool, the more easily can such new groups arise. However, each splitting reduces the potential for further change, and hence, even this is limited.
And it creates a falsifiable prediction. The genetic variability found in paleogenomic sequences should be systematically higher the deeper into the past we go. This is demonstrably not true, so there's a failed prediction.
All the descendants of such an original kind, which was once a species, may then end up being classified together in a much higher taxonomic category, e.g., family.
I love the use of Linnaean families as the default level for the kind because what makes up a family is entirely arbitrary. So what are the chances that in even a few cases, the God-created kinds would line up with the taxonomic groups that humans arbitrarily chose to label as families? Well, basically 0. If kinds are real, they should probably vary between genus and order depending on what we're looking at. And there really shouldn't be a consistent rank at which we find a large majority of kinds.
Take a hypothetically created kind A, truly a biological species, with perhaps a tremendous genetic potential. See Figure 1. For the sake of simplicity, the diagram avoids the issue of what is meant by 2 of each kind aboard the ark.
Yeah, let's for the sake of simplicity ignore the most important event in the history of any gene pool that experienced it. That won't make the following discussion irrelevant.
However, the basic point is not affected.
I find that very hard to believe.
Note that A may even continue as an unchanged group, as may any of the subgroups. Splitting off of daughter populations does not necessarily mean extinction of the parent population.
And that's something I wish more creationists would realize. It's the very reason why asking if humans evolved from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys is a question that betrays a lack of understanding of evolution. And it's the same basic misunderstanding if instead you ask, if birds evolved from dinosaurs, then how can we see birds being eaten by dinosaurs in the fossil record? That second one is a question Answers in Genesis has asked repeatedly in the last few years, despite this article being recommended to me in a video from their Canadian branch. It's like they don't even read their own literature, never mind the scientific literature.
In the case of man, the original group was not diverged sufficiently to produce new species.
Really? So I wonder what Carl does with those other species in the genus Homo, like H. erectus, H. habilis, H. antecessor, H. caprinensis, H. ergaster, H. floresiensis, H. georgicus, H. heidelbergensis, H. juluensis, H. longi, H. luzonensis, H. naledi, H. neanderthalensis, H. rhodesiensis, and H. rudolfensis.
Hence, D1, D2, D3, E1, E2, E3, P1, P2, Q1, QT, Q3, and Q4 are all different species, reproductively isolated. But all the functionally efficient genetic information they contain was present in A. They presumably carry some mutational defects as well.
This would be a much more compelling story if paleogenomics didn't already show that it's false. In fact, I'm honestly not sure that I'll have much more to say beyond cool story, bro, too bad we already know it's fake.
Let us assume that the original kind A has become extinct, and also the populations X, B, C, D, E, P, and Q, but not D1, D2, etc. If X carried some of the original information in A, which is not represented in B or C, then that information is lost forever. Hence, in spite of the fact that there are many new species, which were not originally present, we would have witnessed confirmation of most of the information, loss of some, and nothing new added apart from mutations, harmful defects, or just meaningless noise in the genetic information.
Or, sometimes beneficial mutations that can and do result in entirely new genes making new proteins. But we're pretending that's not a thing. It's amazing the degree to which just looking around at nature can show you that this whole story is nonsense.
All of which is the wrong sort of information change if one is trying to demonstrate protozoan to man evolution.
Good thing we actually do get such information, then, isn't it?
Classifications above species are more or less arbitrary groupings of convenience.
Yeah, including the family where the bozo set the kinds at. Holy, how is he so bad at this?
Based generally on similarities and differences of structure.
I kind of want to scream at this point, but I won't. I respect your oral integrity too much, dear viewer.
It is conceivable that today D1, D2, and D3 could be classified as species belonging to one genus, and E1, E2, and E3 as species in another genus, for example.
That's actually pretty likely.
It could also be that the groups B and C were sufficiently different such that their descendants would today be in different families. We begin to see some of the problems facing a creationist, who tries to delineate today's representatives of the created kinds,
while pretending that other problems that they face, and that are insurmountable in my estimation, simply don't exist.
Creatures may be classified in the same family, for example, on the basis of similarities due to common design, while in fact they belong to two totally different created kinds.
Wow, and you know what? We actually have tested those models, putting the best case scenario as determined by Markov chain Monte Carlo's statistical techniques against the prediction of evolutionary biology to determine whether all primate families could be not related at all or were actually the result of common descent. It was the harshest crushing of a hypothesis that I have ever seen in any paper, and the hypothesis it absolutely crushed was separate ancestry. We cannot actually quantify the chances of separate ancestry being true given the genetics of primates. It's literally 0, according to the paper, in several tests, and range from 3 times 10 to the negative 4th to 2 times 10 to the negative 219th. In other words, no, we know with more confidence than we know almost anything else that common ancestry is true for all primates, humans included, and that separate ancestry is not.
This should sound a note of caution against using morphology alone, as well as pointing out the potential folly of saying, in this case, the Baramanon is the family, in this case, it is the genus, etc.
Yeah, because it's literally impossible to not only determine where a kind is, but also we know that there are no such things with more certainty than we know where the moon is.
Baraman is an accepted creationist term for created kind.
Oh hey, making up bespoke technical jargon not actually used in the relevant field is also a sign of pseudoscience. But also it's horrible Hebrew. You can't just stick a word that means he created in front of a noun and think that you've made a compound noun you can just stick the Greek suffix ology onto. That's not how Hebrew or Greek works. You'd think that since they love Genesis so much that Answers in Genesis would get some Hebrew speakers on staff to figure this shit out, but apparently not. Of course, they're also the ones who are notorious for showing Hebrew texts upside down, because that way it looks left justified. Because of course all languages are just really relexes of English, and work just like English does, down to the grammar and orthography. Which is the thing you would have to think to justify the word baraminology and upside down Hebrew.
There is no easy solution as yet to the problem of establishing each of these genetic relationships.
Yet there should be, since each gene pool would be entirely independent of any other gene pools, meaning that you couldn't find any hierarchical pattern of mutations or retroviral insertions or chromosome structure above the kind level. And yet we do, meaning that life just isn't arranged into a bunch of separately created kinds. It's not a possibility that the data has left open to us.
In fact, we will probably never be able to know them all with certainty.
It would be super cool if just one could actually be demonstrated, and not just assumed, which is what they do with humans. Alas, such a thing has yet to come to pass.
Interbreeding, in vitro fertilization experiments, etc., may suggest membership of the same Baraman, but lack of such genetic compatibility does not prove that two groups are not in the same kind.
Making Baramans, or maybe Baramanim, non-falsifiable under this testing regime, and so not a scientific concept.
See earlier discussion, genetic barrier could arise via mutation deterioration.
Nah, I'm not going to see it because mutation degeneration isn't a real thing in the way Carl means it, and because I don't dispute that speciation, including reproductive isolation, can occur.
However, newer insights enabling us to make direct comparisons between species via DNA sequencing open up an entirely new research horizon.
Yeah, one that utterly destroyed creationist predictions.
Although the question of where the funding for such extensive research will come from in an evolutionary-dominated society remains enigmatic.
Creationists managed to put together a multi-million-dollar building with a wooden facade that looks like Noah's Ark from one side. They could get together some funds for research if they wanted to. But by and large, they don't want to, because they don't care about what the evidence says. They reject evidence that they don't like and cherry-pick or make up evidence that they do like. So what's the point of wasting money on research? That's why they do things like write books for lay audiences and build Jesus-themed parks rather than actually getting any work done in science that's of any significance at all.
What then do we say to an evolutionist who understandably presses us for a definition of a created kind or identification of same today?
Just be honest and say that it's an unfalsifiable bit of pseudoscientific jargon that was made up to explain away evolution that is too obvious to exist, and to get rid of the problem that the ark is way too small to carry enough animals. Of course, no professional creationist would ever be that honest, they just don't have it in them.
I suggest the following for consideration. Groups of living organisms belong in the same created kind if they have descended from the same ancestral gene pool.
Okay, But that just means that all of the evidence says that there is only one kind in existence, and that all extant life belongs to it.
To talk of fixity of kinds in relation to any present-day variants thus also becomes redundant. No new kinds can appear by definition.
Yeah, making this idea just evolution, but you quit after a while of tracing things back.
Besides being a simple and obvious definition, it is axiomatic. Thus, it is as unashamedly circular as a rolled-up armadillo, and just as impregnable, deflecting attention quite properly to the real issue of genetic change.
For which there is ample evidence, making the term useless to creationists. I mean, I'm not going to stop creationists from shooting themselves in the foot.
The question is not, what is a baraman? Is it a species, a genus, or a family? Rather, the question is, which of today's populations are related to each other by this form of common descent, and are thus the same created kind?
All of them, according to every scrap of evidence, and in some cases that claim is so overwhelmingly well supported that it makes creationists' attempts to make up numbers so big or chances so small that they seem ludicrous appear as if they were attempts to seem impressive by a toddler who's watched too much pro wrestling and now wants to seem tough.
Notice that this is vastly removed from the evolutionists' notion of common descent.
Is it? Because it seems to be virtually identical, except that creationists aren't willing to actually follow the data to the end, and they want to give up partway through because it makes them feel uncomfortable to be related to bonobos, bananas, and bacteria.
As the creationist looks back in time along a line of descent, he sees an expansion of the gene pool. As the evolutionist does likewise, he sees a contraction.
Good thing we can actually extract the genomes of some ancient creatures and test this to see which model actually gives better predictions. Spoiler, we did that. It's evolution. As it ever is whenever evolution and special creation have different predictions.
As with all taxonomic questions, common sense will probably continue to play the greatest part.
Not in science, it won't. It plays no part in science. Common sense tells you that the Earth is flat and stationary, that heavy things fall faster than light things, and that there is no speed to light. All of that is very wrong.
The scriptures, the fossil record, and common sense unite to prevent creationists doing too much lumping together as we go back in time.
Well, I guess since only two of those have anything to do with the question, we can see why creationists are so god-awful at science. They accept two sources for their ideas that are just terrible at providing correct answers to scientific questions: common sense and the scripture.
For instance, it is conceivable, though not necessarily so, that crocodiles and alligators both descended from the same ancestral gene pool which contained all their functionally efficient genes, but not really conceivable that crocodiles, alligators, and ostriches had a common ancestral pool which carries the gene for all three.
True enough, I guess. And with that, we're finally back to our Answers in Genesis Canada hosts. It's been a while. It'll almost be nice to be back to them.
Where Dr. Carl Whelan talks about these changes in living things, they're taking things in the wrong direction.
Right.
They're not getting better, they're getting worse. And that's really
Not true?
the answer to, we'll go into more detail here,
Yeah.
but that's the answer to the question.
Not unless the question is, how do creationists lie about observed genetic and evolutionary phenomena?
I mean, really, the thing people need to understand right away is what a mutation is.
It's any variation in the genome from an organism that was not inherited from an ancestor in that state.
You know, if you
Yes.
you watch popular science fiction, mutations are good things. They give you special powers.
X-Men.
And all, yeah, all that kind of stuff.
I don't think anyone actually thinks that the X-Men are real. Mutations are real, and clearly the X-Men aren't. So reality doesn't seem compatible with the idea that mutations will give you laser eyes, shape-shifting, weather control powers, absurd healing factor, or the ability to make playing cards explode.
But when you understand that DNA, obviously a language or code system, we've discussed this before.
And I've discussed it before too. It's not a language, it's not a code. It's a chemical system that has a few loose similarities to a code, but fundamentally acts in a way completely foreign to linguistics. There's a reason why geneticists don't normally co-author papers with linguists. It's because neither has any insights to offer the other, because the objects of their study are not similar to the degree that those disciplines have insights that would be useful to the other.
made up of these chemical letters, when there's spelling errors, that's what a mutation is. As DNA makes copies of itself, you get all these spelling mistakes that can occur. And really what the evolutionist is now saying is if we start off with something simple, the Little Red Riding Hood, if you copy Little Red Riding Hood enough times, you make enough copies with enough spelling errors, millions of times, it's going to turn into the works of Shakespeare sooner or later.
That is in fact possible, but also DNA isn't anything like a copy of Little Red Riding Hood, so we don't need anything like that to happen. All that happens is that the genome determines in large part the phenotype of an organism, and that phenotype is either more or less fit than other phenotypes. And so the underlying genotype either spreads or diminishes in that population. Evolution doesn't have a goal like one might have in terms of hoping that a children's story turns into Shakespeare. Evolution isn't trying to produce humans or anything else. It's just what happened to occur.
Okay.
Really, that's
Which
what you're...
seems absurd when you say it that way.
Right.
But yet it's a legitimate analogy.
No, it's as absurd as it sounds, because it was designed to be absurd in the first place. That's the point of it, to make evolution seem as implausible as possible. That it does sound that implausible isn't exactly groundbreaking.
Well, yeah. I mean, you get a little bit of information, turn into a whole bunch of information, and it's all got to be meaningful with punctuation and purpose and all these types of things.
Right.
Well, it doesn't have teleological purpose. It has teleonomic purpose, as their guy, Carl, already pointed out. But after this, they're going to go over submissions that are presumably attempts to answer their questions, and that seems like as good a place to leave off as any. Next time should hopefully be the last video in this series, and we'll address their attempts to respond to responses, which will likely be as meta as it sounds. If you liked this video, please hit like and let me know what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, I hope you subscribe and check out the channel memberships and my Patreon. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Tapioca Weasel, Sphincter of Doom, Regios, Landon Knoll, Ian Chen, Eleron Teller, Phil Rivera, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, David Hercules, Joshua Geese, Vollus, Dan Sheedy, Pega Jace, The Plastic Mouse, Arrow Dodger, Gordon Love Science, Amber Athelian, Pixie Purple, Agricola Siqua, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, and John Ackerman. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 15% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.